At the very far end of a very distant galaxy, there was once an empty and barren little planet. And this planet just needed a little spark of something to get it started. A little bit of stardust, a little bit of science, a little bit of magic, in order to give it the life that it deserved. Now, the thing about this stardust is it wasn't put there by chance. It was put there on purpose. And this little speck of life was brought to this planet and to many others around this galaxy by a race of super intelligent, very scientific beings. And these beings, they needed to put this life on these planets because their planet was dying out. It had gotten so polluted and so toxic that they had to think of alternate ways to live. And one of the solutions was trying to harvest, not really harvest so much as trying to cultivate life on other planets that they deemed could have a habitable environment. Now, the problem with this is obviously this is time that's being invested. But these scientists needed a more rapid fire solution. They needed something that would take care of now and not just in the future. So this spark of life was put out there on all these planets, and they set up space stations that would orbit these planets to monitor the life and track the environment and figure out which one, if any, would be able to sustain their people when the time came. But of course, in the interim, they needed something else. So these people worked their hardest and they came up with so many different advances. And if you think about the Jetsons, for any of those who may have seen that, they live in these little floating dome houses. It's, they kind of created a solution very similar to that. They were like orbiting houses, and they lived above their environment and in space stations. And their entire way of life became about finding the next best solution, the next best thing. And of course, they're all very intelligent, very scientific minds, and these scientists spent ages coming up with the next best thing. And it developed over time not to just be about the best solution for survival, but the best way to make their lives comfortable and to make their lives fun and enjoyable. And they kind of forgot over time about these planets that they were trying to cultivate. They were still people out there monitoring them, but it became more about the next great invention and what could they do to, create this thing that everybody would want. And the strange thing is, over time, as this became the biggest priority, their species became more loners and more self-involved and more standoffish. They weren't about community and about being together, which, that was the whole point of, cultivating these other planets, was finding a solution for their community. And it became more about finding what would, you know, earn them a place in the annals and history as being this great mind who created this awesome invention, this great virtual reality game, or, whatever it was. And they just kind of begrudgingly spoke with each other when necessary, but they were very, very secretive about their projects. They didn't share in the glory. They didn't share their project and bounce it off each other and work in collaborative teams. It was all for one and one for yourself. Like, it wasn't even all for one. It was one for one and everybody else get out. And, that's a little strange, but that's just how they adapted. And, this is ages down the road that, they just developed this way. Instead of being about community and about each other, they were just about themselves. And as you can imagine, and maybe you see where the story is going, they spending so much time by yourself, you don't really get out there and you don't meet people. And their species started dying out. And not because of the toxic environment, because, I mean, hi, they've created plenty of ways to deal with that in their floating space stations and their secured houses and everything. But they just didn't really spend a lot of time with each other. It was kind of a forced thing. They would teach the children when there were children, but that was more like, okay, we're going to teach you and then peace out later, go do something. And even the children didn't play with each other. You know, they would do their lessons. They would learn what they had to do to become, whatever they needed to be. And, everybody had kind of an assigned role. Some people had scientific minds and they could tell. They could tell when you were a baby, when you were born and very, very young, what you were destined to be. And, people, it's what they did, They had people who had to repair objects and had to repair their devices and their systems, and people who had to control the virtual reality drones to go out there and fix the space stations and anything outside. I mean, if you think about it, somebody's got to do that. But of course, it was all done virtually. They were controlling a drone or a robot that went out and did this. And even when they weren't doing that with, the robots for their responsibilities and their jobs, they were doing that for fun, just completely spending time by themselves in this virtual world somewhere else and not even socializing with each other. And as human beings, it's a little hard to imagine that because we talk to people on a daily basis. And that's part of human life. But it's not how these beings lived. And we understand a little bit. Kids come home from school and they play games with their friends who were across the street and not in the same room. But these kids wouldn't even do that. They were just totally by themselves. And it gets a little, you can imagine that is kind of a weird situation, but that's just kind of how they worked and how they lived, and that's just how they adapted over time. Now, it came to be that there was a boy who was, of course, obviously he was born. I don't need to tell you that. No. But his father is completely unknown, and his mother wanted nothing to do with him because, frankly, a child was just way too much. It would just get in the way of her time to herself. And she just didn't have that kind of nurturing thing. Most of these beings really didn't. They had children because there was such a dwindling population, laws were kind of put into place, and there was no such thing as, abortion for these people. You got pregnant, you had a baby. And, they were kind of working on cloning people. So some other people were clones, but that wasn't working out so good. So, we're not going to get into that because that's just crazy. But this boy was given up, and he was raised in a science facility. And I didn't want anyone to panic. He was not put in a science facility to be tested upon or experimented on. It was just that was his aptitude. That's what they could tell. They knew he was going to be a scientist, and that's where they placed him. So he was raised by fellow scientists, and he was taught all of their different things, how to use his increased brain power that these beings had, how to, do all their sciencey things, just whatever. He learned the broad range, and he went about his studies and, did all these things. But the strange thing about this child is, in this society, most of the people are loners. They're very serious. Their enjoyment comes out of creating that next great thing and being a great mind and doing their work, and not really, yes, they do have recreation and fun, but even that is very all of their things that they do for fun is still in a way, helping their society in some way. Like, we can't grasp that. You play a video game, you have fun, you don't play a game to increase your mind and your logic skills and everything. I mean, yes, you can do that. There are lots of games that do that, but theirs were all about things like that. So their fun was almost like going to school constantly, which doesn't sound like fun, but hey, that's just who they are. But this kid was different. This child was really outgoing, which is really unusual for their species. And, you know, these scientists had to begrudgingly deal with it because he was a very bright child. Now, okay, he's not a special snowflake. He wasn't the smartest child in his class. He didn't have the best abilities. He was just a smart kid, And he had a really good aptitude for scientific pursuits and rocket science and programming and all of those things. But, he kind of got on everybody's nerves because he's just, God, this kid, he's a talker and a chatterbox and he wants to know things. And well, that's great because, hey, you're here to learn and to, progress our species and our technology. But good Lord, kid, stop asking so many questions. And one of the things that most intrigued this boy was that project where they put that spark of life on all these other planets, that little bit of magic stardust. And he was so curious about this, and he asked so many questions. And, yeah, they answered him, but it's kind of like, yeah, that's just some old project nobody cares type of a thing. But, he took it upon himself to go back through the history and learn everything he could about this project. And it was just so intriguing to him to think about how different life could be. And he, on his spare time, would actually go into the databases and read the reports that these space stations were sending back on about these planets. And there was all sorts of crazy things, I mean, there's simoid kind of people, and then there's these weird beasts, and there was one planet that was really in particularly kind of intriguing but scary, was one where there was these weird, they were like dinosaur creatures. That's what we humans have to compare them to. They were much like dinosaurs. But think about a purple brontosaurus that had a face like Wallace from Wallace and Gromit. You know that claymation where he's got the big giant smiley teeth and the giant eyeballs? A face like that, but purple, and on a brontosaurus-y kind of body, but a nubby little tail, not a long one. But, the big fat body and the big fat legs and the long gangly neck with a Wallace face and like weird pointy ears, kind of like cat ears, but longer. Not quite bunny rabbit ears, but can you imagine? That's a little weird. They had all sorts of crazy animals, but that one, oddly enough, don't tell anybody this because this is between you and I and our boy. He doodled a picture in his notebook. He would keep notes and things, and he, kind of doodled a picture of this monster because, it was just described, and there didn't send back photos of any of these planets, which it seems really weird. But again, the scientists that were out on these space stations were really the dregs of the science community. They were either, well, not necessarily the dregs. They were either the dregs of the science community where you are never going to contribute, and unfortunately you're a bright mind, you're smarter than, average people, but you're not helping, and they just want to get you out of the way. So they send you to one of these space stations where you're not going to annoy anybody and you're not going to drag them down, basically. I mean, talk about stuffy and snobby, right? And then the other scientists that would go into these space stations went there by choice because they were super loners. Like, obviously, there's some interaction between these beings, but, some of them were just like, God, even having a look at another one of you is too much. And they would volunteer for these. And these were decade-long jobs. Like, you went there till you died or you were going to retire pretty much. Like, this was your life. And, that suited some of these guys, you know? But this little boy, now, I keep referring to him as the boy, but he does have a name, of course, but unfortunately, it would take about like 7 minutes to say his name, and we don't really have any kind of sounds that would really work. Uh, Picture this. If you were to take every character from every language on Earth and put it each letter character on a Scrabble tile and mix them all up and then throw that at the wall and see what 47 character word sticks. Try to pronounce that because that's what you got. That's his name. So that's pretty much it. It's impossible. My brain might explode if I try to say it, so I'm not going to try. I'm just going to let it go. So we're just going to keep referring to him as the boy or our guy and whatnot. So you know who we're talking about. So anyway, you know, this boy, he learned over time, obviously, as a child, being a bright kid, that, he was a little off, and he could see the other scientists getting a little irritated with him, with how much of a chatterbox he was and everything. So he kind of tried to rein that in, but it was killing him. It's against his nature, but he learned, and he did the best he could. But he was always so curious about everything, and so he would take it upon himself to learn these things and read every book that he could find and search the databases, and that's how he spent his time. And he kind of invented little stories because that's not something that his people normally did, but obviously he did. And just don't tell anyone this, but their observatory was a really great place for him to go and hide. And everybody, when they saw him go, oh, great, he's going to observe the skies. Awesome, great, he's doing some work or learning things. He would go in there and talk to himself and tell himself stories and have imaginary friends. And that's so adorably cute for a normal human child, but it's so very sad for a child of his race because, that's just not how his people work. And it's sad that he had to do that, but he may do. And this boy grew up, obviously. Hey. And when he was getting a little bit older, he wasn't quite at the point of being a young adult. He was basically a teenager, what we would consider a teenager. He was still the same kid at heart, but he had learned at that point how to rein it in and keep it quiet to himself. So, he went about doing his jobs around studying their species, studying the animals and the things that they would try to breed and the monstrosities that they would breed, things with like 8 eyeballs and like creepiness, but kind of cute but creepy at the same time. But anyway, I digress. And he kept thinking about this project, and these other planets that were out there, and it came to pass that there was a scientist on a very distant space station, on a very distant planet, way out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this thing is so far out, don't even get me started. It would take us forever to get there. We would die before we ever reached there. But of course, they're way better at, light speed travel. And it was a distance. It was probably the furthest out planet that they had tried to cultivate. And this scientist was retiring. He was old and on his deathbed, and he was like, I'm done with this, I'm coming home. And of course, they didn't really necessarily have anyone at the moment to free up to go out there. And our little friend actually requested to go out there. And he knew that they wouldn't stop him because, they want to get rid of him. He knew, he's smart enough to know that he does not fit in with their society, and the rest of his community is just frustrated with him. And this is the perfect opportunity for him to be able to, open up and just be himself because he's not going to be around anyone else, so it's going to be fine. And to learn more about this other planet and to be there and to watch these whatever creatures happen to live on this planet, and he's so excited about this. So he asks, and says that he'd like to volunteer, and he knows that he's still a little bit young. He's not quite a young adult, and that's, usually the point where they send you, and he's got a year or two to go, but he really, really wants to go and do this. And, of course, he doesn't tell them how excited he is to go. He, presents it obviously in a very professional and standoffish way, like they would, that, he thinks that he could do this job, and he knows that nobody else, they don't have anyone else available, and most people don't want to do this job, and he's more than happy to do it for his people. And of course, no one's going to argue. They are all ecstatic, if they even can feel that emotion at this point, and they let him go. So they send him off, and it probably takes him a month or more to get out there at this like light speed travel. I mean, I'm not a scientist. My brain cannot even wrap around how fast they travel. So he gets out there, and the scientist that's going to retire explains to him about, the planet and what his job roles will be. He doesn't really tell him too much about the planet. It's like, okay, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's some life down there, whatever. Here's what you have to do. Here's how to work the equipment and everything. And of course, our guy, he knows kind of how to do this. It's something they learned, and it's the same equipment and everything. It's just a little bit older. I mean, there were some upgrades, but they haven't upgraded it in a long time. But, so he's there, and he's so ecstatic and so happy. And our other scientist leaves our boy by himself. And for the first time in his life, he feels totally free. It's like a relief. So he gets about studying this planet. And, of course, because he's so interested in his job, he is sending back data constantly. Now, it's his job to send back information, but for the most part, nobody cares. That's like in some locked basement somewhere where this is all stored and nobody really Yeah, people look. Okay, yeah, you're looking. It's somebody's job to look, but again, it's almost like, just check it, fine, okay, we got stuff, whatever. They do it because it's their responsibility and they're very responsible people, but nobody really cares. They don't usually fill it, but he is sending it back. For anyone who remembers printers back in the day, when all the paper was attached, and it was a giant ream of paper, and it was all, and had the perforated dots that you would like rip each page apart, and it had like the little tabbies on the side where the holes, and you would feed it into the printer, and like if you printed 50 pages, it would literally be this one long strip of 50 pages, and you had to tear the paper apart. Like, imagine that, right? Granted, okay, everything he's sending back is digital, but imagine if it was printed. He would have a Scrooge McDuck vault filled with so much paper you could walk across it. Like, it's just huge amounts of paper. And if this were actually printing out and someone had to shred this paper, the shredder wouldn't even be able to keep up. He was just so thorough. And because he was enjoying it and this was so great to him. But of course, no one's reading this, so no one notices when he starts sending back reports that there's some weird stuff going on. There's some strange seismic activity on the planet, and there's some weird cosmic radiation shit or something. I don't understand scientific things, so I can't tell you exactly what he was sending back and what he was telling them, but there's some weird stuff going on out there, and it's causing, like, I don't know, solar flares, something. I can't even explain it to you. My mind can't even grasp it because it's just, I'm not a scientist. I don't know. I'm doing the best I can here. Plus, it's really hard to read their language because, we remember the story we remember talking about his name, right? Yeah. So, basically, he's sending back these reports that there's shit's hitting the fan, basically. Pardon my language. And, of course, he's not getting any response back. And he's trying to communicate. He actually tries to call his homeworld, but all of a sudden he's got no communication. It's very staticky, it's very fuzzy, and he realizes that, oh my god, like all of this weird stuff that's going on out here is affecting his communications. And, he is kind of concerned about that. But, he can repair things. So he works on that. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, solar flare, this cosmic energy, whatever it is that's affecting this planet and going on right now, just knocks out his space station completely. He loses all power and so many systems are fried that he doesn't have the necessary equipment to fix it. He doesn't have the tools. He doesn't have the resources, not enough. And he makes an executive decision. And he decides, with all the studying he's done of this planet, he knows that there are minerals and metals and things down there that he could use to fix his space station. Some of the things are still working. It's not totally fried, I guess. But, his communication's gone. There's nothing he can do except for he's going to sit there and twiddle his thumbs. He needs to fix some stuff. So he needs these supplies. So he decides he's going to get into his emergency pod and he's going to go to the planet, totally away from the people. He doesn't want to disturb the life because, it's not Star Trek, but, he's following the Star Trek Prime Directive kind of here where, I'm not going to interfere with the people or anything, but I need to go around and harvest. So, as his people can do, he disguises himself to look like one of these beings. Because they're completely different looking than him. And, so he disguises himself and he goes down to the planet. But on his path, on his way to the planet, there's just another wave of this cosmic shit going on. And it completely knocks his trajectory off. He had planned to land in a secluded area where he could hide his pod and no one would see it. And now, my God, now all this is happening and he's crashing and he's trying to gain control, but he can't. He has no idea what's going on. And he's going out of control, and the last thing that he sees before he completely blacks out is just the ground rushing up to meet him. And that, my friends and my lovely space muffins, is where we start the story of life in Stardust. And that is where we end. And when we come back in our first episode, I will give you a little bit of a backstory to the challenge. And I will also continue on and tell you what happens to our friend after he crashes on the planet. But you're going to have to wait. So I hope you enjoyed this brief history of Stardust and how life came to be. And I will see you guys next time. So remember, give the video a big thumbs up and subscribe to see more.